I was looking for solitude. Life had been chaotic, constant deadlines, endless notifications, people always needing something from me. I wanted nothing more than to escape for a few days, just me, my laptop, and nature. A cabin in the woods seemed perfect. No distractions, no obligations, just quiet. When I found a rustic little place listed on Airbnb, far from any major town, I booked it without hesitation. The pictures showed a cozy one-bedroom cabin surrounded by towering pine trees, a small fireplace in the corner, and a desk positioned near a large window overlooking the forest. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive up was long, winding, and isolated. No gas stations, no convenience stores, just miles of dense forest. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road barely wide enough for my car, lined with trees that seemed to press inward. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place looked just like the photos, quaint, with a slightly weathered charm. The key was in a lockbox by the door, just as the host had described in their check-in instructions. I let myself in, set my bags down, and did a quick walkthrough. The living room was small but inviting, with a well-used couch and an old coffee table stacked with magazines. The kitchen had the bare essentials, and the bedroom was simple, just a bed, a wooden dresser, and a single nightstand. The air smelled faintly of pine and aged wood. Everything seemed fine. At first, I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking my laptop, making a cup of tea, and stretching out on the couch. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that city life never allows. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and occasionally, I heard the distant hoot of an owl. It felt safe. That changed when I noticed the draft. I was sitting at the desk, working on my laptop, when I felt a cool gust of air against my legs. At first, I thought it was coming from a window, but when I checked, they were all shut tight. I walked around the cabin, trying to find the source, and that's when I saw it, a slight movement behind the curtain in the bedroom. There was something behind it. Heart pounding, I reached out and pulled the curtain aside. A small, square door was built into the wall, flush with the wooden paneling. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended in too well. There was no handle, just a simple latch near the bottom. A crawlspace. I hesitated. I didn't like the idea of opening it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Kneeling, I unlatched the door and pulled it open. A dark void stretched before me, just large enough for someone to crawl inside. The space was lined with wooden beams, the air inside cold and stale. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. That's when I saw them. Sleeping bags. At least 3, all bunched up in the farthest corner. Scattered around them were empty food wrappers, a plastic water bottle, and an old, dirt-covered jacket. The sight made my stomach turn. Someone had been living in there. Recently, a wave of nausea rolled through me. I slammed the small door shut, my hands trembling as I latched it. My mind raced through possibilities. Had the previous guests left this behind? Had someone used this as a hiding spot? Or worse, were they still here? I stood up quickly, checking the locks on the cabin door. Secure. Windows? Secure. But that didn't ease my growing sense of unease. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an old hiding spot, or something a previous guest had used for storage. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, my skin crawled at the thought of someone squeezing into that space, lying there while I was just a few feet away. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I kept the bedroom door locked, though I knew it wouldn't do much good if someone really wanted to get in. My mind kept going back to that crawl space, the discarded belongings, the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off, but it wasn't restful. I woke up to a sound, a soft, barely audible scratching coming from behind the crawlspace door. My entire body tensed. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Maybe I had imagined it, the remnants of a bad dream lingering in my half-asleep mind. But then there it was again. Scratching. Slow, deliberate. Something was in there. I shot up, my pulse hammering in my ears. My first instinct was to get out, grab my keys, my bag, and leave. But my curiosity was overpowering my fear. I crept toward the crawlspace door, careful not to make a sound. My breath caught as I crouched down, reaching out with a shaking hand to unfasten the latch. I swung the door open. The space was empty. Nothing but the discarded sleeping bags and trash. But the air inside felt wrong. Heavy, like something had just been there. I shone my flashlight along the walls, the corners, the floor. Then my light landed on something new. Something that hadn't been there before. Footprints. Faint impressions in the dust. Leading out of the crawl space. Leading into the cabin. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I spun around, scanning the room, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The cabin was small. There weren't many places to hide. And yet, the closet door was slightly ajar. It had been shut when I went to bed. I was sure of it. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then movement. A barely perceptible shift of shadows inside the closet. Someone was in there. I bolted, grabbed my keys and my phone, and ran out the door into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly I struggled to get the key in the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I slammed it into reverse, speeding down the dirt road, not daring to look back. I drove straight into town and checked into the first motel I found. The next morning, I reported the Airbnb to customer service. They assured me they would look into it. The listing was removed within hours. A few weeks later, I was still haunted by the experience. On a whim, I searched the cabin's address. Buried in old news articles, I found something that made my blood run cold. A man had once been arrested in that same area, squatting in remote cabins, breaking in and hiding in crawl spaces, waiting for guests to fall asleep. He had never been caught again after making bail. I don't know if it was him that night. I don't want to know. But I will never, ever stay in another cabin alone again. I had been looking forward to a quiet getaway for weeks. Work had been exhausting, and I needed a break from the city. I found a charming Airbnb listing in a rural town a few hours away. An old house with a wraparound porch, advertised as a peaceful retreat. It was listed as a private room rental, but the host had clearly marked that he would not be present during my stay. That was one of the main reasons I booked it. The place looked even better in person. The house was nestled on the edge of a forest, surrounded by towering pine trees. It had a rustic charm, wooden beams, an old-fashioned fireplace, and cozy furnishings. The host, a man named Richard, had left a key under the doormat, just as he'd instructed. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt at home. The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. It wasn't until the second evening that things started to feel off. I had spent the day exploring a nearby lake and returned around sunset. As I approached the house, I noticed a car parked in the driveway that hadn't been there before. A dark blue sedan, older model, covered in dirt. My first thought was that it belonged to a neighbor or maybe someone visiting another house nearby. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The car was occupied. A man was sitting in the driver's seat, motionless, staring straight ahead. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and a pale face. His hands rested on the steering wheel, knuckles white. I tried not to panic. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he had parked there by mistake. I walked past, avoiding eye contact, and entered the house quickly, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was nothing. But an hour later, when I glanced outside, the car was still there. And the man was still inside, still staring. I considered calling the host, but then I realized something. Could that be him? I pulled up the Airbnb listing and clicked on the host's profile. The grainy profile picture was small, but the face was unmistakable. It was him. Why was he sitting outside his own rental? And why hadn't he told me he'd be coming back? I messaged him through the app. Hey Richard, I noticed your car outside. Just wanted to check if everything's okay. No response. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. The car didn't move. He didn't even seem to check his phone. He just sat there, staring. I tried to ignore it, but the unease was impossible to shake. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and closed the curtains. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe he had just forgotten something inside the house and was waiting for the right moment to come in without disturbing me. Then, at exactly 11:42 p.m., my phone buzzed. A message from Richard. Do you need anything? That was it. No acknowledgement of my earlier message, no explanation for why he was outside. Just a vague, unsettling question. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off all the lights and went to bed, hoping he'd leave overnight. But when I woke up the next morning and cautiously peered outside, the car was still there. And Richard was still in it. I decided that was it. I packed my things, threw my bag over my shoulder, and walked straight to my car. As I backed out of the driveway, I stole one last glance at Richard's car. He was looking directly at me now, smiling. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I reported the incident to Airbnb, but they only offered a partial refund and removed the listing. Richard's profile disappeared soon after. I still have no idea what he wanted, and I don't want to know. I had been planning this trip for months. A week-long stay in a historic Airbnb apartment in a small European town, surrounded by cobblestone streets, charming cafes, and centuries-old architecture. As someone who had always romanticized old buildings and their history, I was drawn to this particular apartment because it had been around for over 100 years, meticulously preserved with its original wooden beams, intricate molding, and antique furniture. When I arrived, everything seemed perfect. The apartment was on the top floor of a 3-story building, overlooking a quiet street. The host, an older woman named Marguerite, greeted me warmly and showed me around. She explained that the apartment had once been part of a larger family home before being sectioned into rental units. It had high ceilings, tall windows, and a rustic charm that made me feel like I had stepped back in time. There was only one thing that slightly unsettled me: the attic hatch in the bedroom ceiling. It was a square wooden panel, painted white to blend in, but I noticed it immediately. Something about it made me uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It was probably just the thought of what could be up there: old furniture, forgotten belongings, maybe even dust-covered relics from a bygone era. Still, I shrugged it off and reminded myself that old houses always had their quirks. The first night passed uneventfully. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from my travels. But on the second night, things took a turn. I woke up abruptly at around 3 a.m. to a sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first. It was a creaking noise, as if something above me had shifted. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the apartment was silent again. I turned over, telling myself it was just the wood settling, a common occurrence in old buildings. The next morning, I checked the attic hatch. It looked the same as before, closed, sealed tightly. I let out a breath of relief and laughed at myself for getting spooked over nothing. That night, I made sure to lock the bedroom door, not because I thought anything was inside the attic, but simply for peace of mind. I fell asleep faster this time, but again, I was woken up in the middle of the night, this time by a distinct thud. My eyes shot open, and I instinctively reached for my phone. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I lay there, heart racing, ears straining for any sound. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creaking from above. It was coming from the attic. I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling, my breath shallow. The creaking continued, this time accompanied by a faint rustling, as if something was shifting just beyond the hatch. Then, the air in the room changed. It was subtle, but I felt it, the slightest draft brushing against my face. That was when I saw it. The attic hatch was open. Not completely, but just enough, a gap of about 2 inches. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact that it had been shut tight when I went to bed. I wanted to believe there was some logical explanation. Maybe the old wood had warped. Maybe there was a draft strong enough to push it open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That hatch had been closed. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the ceiling. The light reflected off the pale wood of the hatch, revealing the dark void beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing peered down at me. But the knowledge that it had opened on its own was enough to send a chill down my spine. I debated what to do. Should I try to push it shut? Call the host? Pack up and leave? The rational part of me told me that I was overreacting, but my gut told me otherwise. I decided I couldn't sleep in the bedroom with that hatch open. Carefully, I got out of bed and moved to the living room, locking the door behind me. I lay down on the couch, my heart still hammering in my chest, but eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I forced myself to check the bedroom. The attic hatch was closed again. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that maybe I had imagined the whole thing in a half-asleep state. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it had been open. I sent a message to Marguerite, the host, asking if there was any chance the attic was in use or if something could have caused it to open. She responded within minutes. No one has been up there for decades. It is sealed. It should not be able to open. That was all she said. I wanted to press for more details. What did she mean by sealed? Had other guests reported anything similar? But something about her short response made me feel like she didn't want to discuss it. I tried to go about my day as normally as possible. I explored the town, visited the markets, had coffee at a charming little cafe. But the entire time, I couldn't shake the unease that followed me. I dreaded the thought of returning to the apartment that night. When I did, I made sure to check the attic hatch before going to bed. Still closed. That night, I slept with the bedside lamp on. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up again. The room felt different, heavier. I didn't hear creaking this time, no thud, no shifting above me. But something made my skin crawl. I slowly turned my head toward the ceiling. The attic hatch was wide open. Not just a small gap this time, but fully open, revealing the gaping blackness above. My blood ran cold. I could see the edges of the attic space, old wooden beams covered in dust. But what terrified me most was the feeling that something was looking down at me, something I couldn't see. I bolted from the bed, grabbed my bag, and ran. I didn't stop to lock the door, didn't care about my deposit, didn't even bother texting Marguerite. I just ran until I was outside on the dark, empty street, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I booked a hotel for the rest of my stay. I never went back to that apartment. A few days later, I checked the listing out of curiosity. It had been removed. I'll never know what was in that attic, or why the hatch kept opening. But whatever it wasn't meant to be seen. Traveling on a budget meant looking for cheap accommodations, and Airbnb often had great deals. My best friend Chris and I were on a road trip across the country, stopping at various cities along the way. We had booked an Airbnb in a quiet suburban neighborhood for 3 nights. The listing described it as a cozy basement apartment, which seemed like a great deal for the price. The pictures looked decent, and while the host, a man named Greg, had only a handful of reviews, they were all positive. When we arrived, the house was an older 2-story home with a detached garage. The front yard was unkempt, the grass overgrown, and an old car sat in the driveway, covered in dust. It didn't look quite as inviting as the photos had suggested, but we had already paid, and our other options were either way out of budget or fully booked. Greg greeted us at the door. He was a man in his late 50s, balding with a patchy beard and a slightly hunched posture. He smiled, but something about him seemed off. His eyes lingered a little too long, and his handshake was weak and clammy. "Welcome, welcome," he said, stepping aside to let us in. "Hope the drive wasn't too bad. Let me show you around." The entrance to the basement was through the main house, past an old kitchen with linoleum floors and a narrow hallway lined with faded wallpaper. He led us to a door at the end of the hall, which opened to a steep staircase. "The basement's all yours," he said. "Got your own entrance from the backyard, too. Just make yourselves at home." We carried our bags down. The basement had a musty smell, like old furniture and damp wood. It was furnished with an old couch, a small TV, a kitchenette, and a single bathroom. There were 2 bedrooms, both with creaky wooden doors. "Not bad for the price," Chris said, dropping his backpack on one of the beds. Greg hovered at the top of the stairs. "Cell service might be spotty down there, but the Wi-Fi works fine," he said. "Oh, and that door at the back." He pointed to a locked wooden door near the kitchenette. "That leads to a storage area. Just ignore it." That immediately put me on edge. Something about locked doors in rental places always made me uneasy. But we nodded, and Greg finally went back upstairs, closing the door behind him. That night, we ordered takeout and settled in to watch a movie. The basement had a strange atmosphere. The air was thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Chris, always the rational one, told me I was just being paranoid. Then, at around 2 a.m., I woke up. A faint sound reached my ears, something shifting in the darkness. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The noise was coming from the locked door near the kitchenette. It was subtle, like someone shifting their weight or moving something around. I held my breath, staring at the door. The knob didn't move, there were no footsteps, but I knew what I heard. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it Greg? Did he keep something or someone in there? I told myself I was imagining things, but I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I mentioned it to Chris, but he brushed it off. Old houses make noises. You're overthinking it. That day, we spent most of our time exploring the city. When we returned that evening, Greg was sitting in the living room upstairs, drinking coffee. "How was your day?" he asked, smiling too widely. "Great," Chris said. I nodded, but I kept my responses short. "Good, good," Greg muttered. "Oh, just a heads up, I'm going to be in and out tonight. Got some things to take care of." We went back downstairs, and after a few hours of TV, I started to feel uneasy again. The air in the basement felt heavier, the silence deeper. Then, just as I was about to head to bed, the sound returned. A soft shuffling, followed by a faint thud. I froze. This time, it was unmistakable. Something was in that storage room. I motioned to Chris, who had also heard it. He looked at me, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said. "But I don't like it." Another sound. This time, it was clearer breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. Chris grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. He crept toward the door, pressing his ear against it. "There's someone in there," he mouthed. My stomach dropped. I gestured for him to step back. "We need to leave. Now." We packed our bags in record time, moving as quietly as possible. We had to go through the main house to leave, but the idea of running into Greg was terrifying. As we climbed the stairs, the floor creaked under our weight. Just as Chris reached for the doorknob, we heard it, the sound of the storage room door unlocking. I nearly stopped breathing. Chris turned the knob, and we burst into the hallway, slamming the basement door behind us. We hurried toward the front door, but just as we reached it, Greg stepped out of the kitchen. He looked at us, then at our bags. "Going somewhere?" "Yeah, something came up. We have to leave early," Chris said, forcing a smile. Greg's expression darkened. "It's the middle of the night. What's the rush?" "Just a change of plans," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, without another word, he stepped aside. We bolted to the car. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the house. In the dim light, I saw something, or someone, standing in the basement window, watching us leave. We never reported it. I wish we had. Months later, I saw the same listing still up on Airbnb. Different photos, slightly different description. Same host. Whoever was in that basement was still there. I had been traveling alone for a while, and by then, I was used to staying in different Airbnbs. I preferred them over hotels. Cheaper, more personal, often with little touches that made me feel at home. This one was no different, at least at first. A small guest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, just outside a mid-sized city. It had good reviews, a reasonable price, and the host was communicative. I arrived in the afternoon, parked my rental car in the gravel driveway, and let myself in with the keypad code the host had sent. The place was simple but clean, a small kitchen, a bathroom, a cozy bedroom, and a little sitting area with a couch and a TV. Nothing fancy, but perfect for a short stay. I locked the door behind me, a habit I had formed while traveling alone. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind where people walked their dogs and watered their lawns. I felt safe. That feeling didn't last. The first evening was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, watched some TV, and scrolled on my phone. Around 10 p.m., I locked the doors again, checked the windows, and went to bed. Sometime later, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark, and everything was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Then I heard it. A knock at the door. Soft. Hesitant. Not the kind of knock you'd expect from someone who knew they were supposed to be there. I glanced at my phone. 3:12 a.m. I lay still listening. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind, or... Another knock. Louder this time. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Someone was outside. I tiptoed to the front window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the blinds. A woman stood on the porch, barefoot, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Her hair was matted, her skin pale. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the door. My breath caught in my throat. She knocked again, louder. Then, in a shaky voice, she spoke. "Please let me in." I didn't move, didn't answer. Something felt off. If she was in trouble, why wasn't she knocking on other houses? Why was she out here barefoot, in the middle of the night? I reached for my phone and typed a message to my host. "Hey, there's a woman outside knocking on the door. Do you know anything about this?" No response. The woman knocked again. This time, more urgently. I crept back to the window and peeked out again. She was closer now, standing directly in front of the door. Her breathing looked heavy, her shoulders rising and falling. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She turned her head slowly, too slowly, until she was looking directly at the window I was hiding behind. She saw me. Her mouth curled into the faintest, unnatural smile. I ducked away from the window, heart pounding so hard I thought she might hear it. My phone buzzed. The host had finally responded. Lock the doors. Do not let her in. I was already way ahead of him. Another message. I'll explain later. Just don't open the door. I wanted an explanation now, but before I could type back, I heard the doorknob rattle. I froze. Then I heard her voice again, but this time it was different. Lower. Almost a whisper. Please. I'm cold. Let me in. A long silence. Then, I know you're in there. I gripped my phone with shaking hands. Then I made a mistake. I turned on the porch light. Through the peephole, I got my first clear look at her. She was young, maybe mid-20s, but her face looked gaunt, hollow. Her gown was dirty, stained with something dark. Her bare feet were scraped up, as if she had been walking for miles. But it was her eyes that unsettled me the most. Too wide, too alert, too focused. I took a deep breath and spoke through the door. I can't let you in. Do you need me to call someone? She didn't react at first, just kept staring at the door. Then slowly she took a step back. Then another. She turned and walked away. Just like that. I waited, holding my breath. Maybe she really had just been lost. Maybe she. Then I heard the back door rattle. She had circled around the house. I called 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled the numbers at first. A dispatcher picked up. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, trying to keep my voice from shaking. There's a woman outside my Airbnb. She won't leave. The dispatcher asked for the address. I gave it to her. She asked if I was alone. I hesitated, then admitted that I was. That's when I heard the window tap. I turned my head slowly. The woman was standing outside my bedroom window. Too close. Her hand was pressed against the glass. She was grinning. The dispatcher was still talking, but I barely heard her. I whispered into the phone. She's at my window. I heard sirens in the distance. The woman didn't move. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. By the time the police arrived, there was no sign of her. Just faint footprints in the dirt outside the window. The police took my statement, checked the area, and told me they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night. They didn't find her. I barely slept. The next morning, I called the host, demanding to know what had happened. There was a long pause before he answered. She's been seen here before, he admitted. Always at night. Always knocking on the door. I asked him if he knew who she was. Another long pause. Then he said, she used to live here. I left that day. I never got a full explanation. Never learned her name, or why she kept coming back. But sometimes late at night, when I hear an unexpected knock, I remember that face in the window. I travel alone a lot. Some people find that strange, but I like the solitude. No obligations, no schedules, just me, my thoughts, and whatever quiet place I've booked for the weekend. This time, it was a small, secluded cabin in the mountains, listed as a peaceful retreat with complete privacy. I found it on Airbnb while searching for a weekend getaway. The pictures showed a rustic but cozy wooden cabin surrounded by dense trees, far from any neighbors or roads. It was exactly what I wanted, somewhere I could unwind, read, and disconnect. The reviews were mostly positive, though a few guests had mentioned that the host was a bit odd. I didn't think much of it. I booked it for 3 nights. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The drive was long, winding up through the mountains on narrow, empty roads. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. By the time I reached the cabin, I hadn't seen another car or person for miles. It was a beautiful place, smaller than I expected, but charming. A single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch, a stone chimney, and large windows that overlooked the thick forest. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirping of birds. The key was in a lockbox, just as the host had described in his message. I let myself in, carrying my bags inside. The interior was simple but warm, wood-paneled walls, a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a bedroom with a queen-sized bed. Everything seemed normal. At first, after unpacking, I made myself a quick dinner and settled on the couch with a book. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, just silence and the soft crackling of the fire I had lit in the fireplace. A few hours passed. It was dark outside now, pitch black beyond the windows. I had this slight, uneasy feeling, but I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. Around 10 p.m., I decided to take a shower before bed. The bathroom was small, with an old clawfoot tub and a narrow window facing the woods. As I stood under the hot water, I had this sudden strange feeling, like I was being watched. I turned, wiping the steam off the glass, but saw nothing. Just darkness and trees. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But when I stepped out of the shower, something caught my eye. A tiny red light, blinking. It was coming from the corner of the bathroom, near the vent. My stomach tightened. I leaned in closer, my wet hair dripping onto the tiled floor. It was a camera, a hidden camera. A small, black device tucked into the vent, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the bathroom. That's when I saw another one. This one wedged into a corner near the ceiling, facing the shower. I felt sick. My mind raced. How many cameras were there? How long had they been here? Was the host watching me right now? I threw on my clothes, grabbed my bag, and ran to the bedroom. My hands were shaking as I began searching, and I found more. One inside the bedside lamp, another in the smoke detector. There were cameras all over the cabin. In the living room, one was disguised as a decorative wall hook. In the kitchen, one was hidden inside a clock. I ripped them out, one by one, my breath coming in short gasps. Then my phone buzzed. A message from the host. "Everything okay? You seem unsettled." I stared at the screen, frozen. How did he know? Had he seen me find the cameras? Was he watching me right now? I didn't respond. I grabbed my car keys, stuffed my essentials into my backpack, and bolted for the door. The moment I stepped outside, my phone buzzed again. Going somewhere. I ran to my car, heart hammering, fumbling to unlock the door. My hands were sweaty, shaking. I got in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. That's when I noticed something. My rearview mirror was angled wrong, like someone else had been in my car. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. My instincts screamed at me to leave right now. I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, gravel kicking up behind me. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone emerging from the cabin. But there was no one, just darkness and trees. I drove as fast as I could, heart pounding, not daring to stop until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and finally let out a shaky breath. I called Airbnb's customer service, barely able to form sentences. They asked if I had proof. I sent them pictures of the cameras I had found. They put me on hold for what felt like forever. Then they came back with something chilling. The listing had disappeared. Gone. As if it had never existed. The host's profile was also deleted. They told me they'd investigate. They refunded me, apologized, and said they'd report it to law enforcement. But that was it. No explanation. No closure. I checked the local news for weeks after that, trying to see if the guy had been caught. Nothing. It was like he had never existed. But somewhere, on some hard drive, on some screen, I knew there were videos of me. And I'd never know where they ended up. It's been months since that night, and I still can't shake the paranoia. I don't book Airbnbs anymore. Even in hotels, I check every smoke detector, every clock, every vent. I avoid staying alone in unfamiliar places. I don't know if the host had done this before, or how many others had been recorded without knowing it. I don't even know if he was working alone. All I know is that I'll never feel completely safe in a rental home again. And every time I think about that message, going somewhere, I wonder just how close he really was. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After weeks of long work hours and the stress of city life, I finally had a chance to take a break. I wanted something quiet, away from the noise, away from people. A secluded house in the countryside sounded perfect. I found it on Airbnb, a beautiful 2-bedroom house with a large backyard, surrounded by trees, and advertised as a peaceful retreat for writers and artists. The pictures showed a cozy, well-furnished interior with warm lighting, wooden floors, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. It seemed perfect. The listing had great reviews, too. Guests praised the location, the privacy, and the well-maintained home. The host, someone named Michael, had a profile with a few other listings, all of which had high ratings. Everything seemed legitimate. I booked it for 5 nights. The drive was peaceful. After about 3 hours on the highway, I took a smaller road that wound through dense forests. The farther I drove, the fewer houses I saw. Soon, it was just trees, open fields, and the occasional farmhouse in the distance. By the time I reached the house, the sun was beginning to set. It was exactly as advertised, perhaps even more beautiful in person. A single-story house with a sloped roof, a large porch, and an expansive backyard that stretched toward the trees. There were no other houses nearby, just nature. The key was in a lockbox by the front door, just as Michael had described in his check-in instructions. I entered the code, retrieved the key, and stepped inside. The interior smelled of wood and faintly of something floral, maybe an air freshener. Everything was clean and organized. The furniture was rustic but comfortable. A fireplace sat against one wall in the living room, with a neatly stacked pile of firewood beside it. I took a quick tour of the place. The kitchen was fully stocked. The bathroom was modern, with fresh towels folded neatly on a rack. Both bedrooms were cozy, with large beds and thick blankets. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. The first night passed uneventfully. I cooked a simple dinner, had a glass of wine, and read for a while before going to bed. The next morning, I woke up to soft sunlight filtering through the curtains. I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch to enjoy the crisp morning air. That's when I saw a man walking up the driveway. He was middle-aged, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt. He looked ordinary enough, but something about the way he walked made me uneasy. Purposeful, determined. I set my coffee down and stepped forward as he reached the porch. "Morning," I said cautiously. He didn't return the greeting. Instead, he frowned and asked, "What are you doing here?" His voice was calm but firm. I hesitated. I rented this place through Airbnb. His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked even more confused. "This is my house," he said. I felt my stomach drop. "What?" "I live here," he repeated. "I never put it on Airbnb." I stared at him, my mind struggling to make sense of what he was saying. "There must be some mistake," I said quickly. "I booked it online. The host, Michael, he sent me the check-in details." His face darkened. "There is no Michael." A chill ran down my spine. I pulled out my phone, opened the Airbnb app, and showed him the listing. "Look, this is the house. I booked it for 5 nights. He barely glanced at the screen before shaking his head. "That's my address, but I never listed it. Someone must have broken in and taken those photos." I felt a sudden urge to run back inside, to check every room, to make sure I was actually alone. "Are you saying someone else has access to this house?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "I don't know," he admitted. "But you shouldn't be here." For the first time since arriving, I noticed something off. The house was clean, yes, but now I wondered, had someone staged it for rental? Were things exactly how the real owner had left them? I thought about the lockbox outside. Had someone else installed it? The man took a deep breath and said, "I need to call the police." I didn't argue. We stepped inside together. I had locked the door the night before, but now I felt exposed, vulnerable. This wasn't a rental house. It was someone's home. The man moved cautiously, scanning the space. He checked the kitchen, the bedrooms, the closets. Nothing seemed out of place until we reached the hallway. He stopped in front of a door. "That's the basement," he said, his voice tight. "Did you go down there?" I shook my head. I didn't even notice it. His hand hesitated on the doorknob. Then, slowly, he turned it and pushed the door open. The basement was dark. The air smelled stale, like wood and dust. We both stepped down cautiously, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. Then we saw them. Sleeping bags. 2 of them, laid out in the corner, along with food wrappers, empty water bottles, and a backpack. Someone had been living down here. Recently. I felt sick. The man swore under his breath and pulled out his phone to call the police. I was already backing away, my skin crawling. Had they been here while I was sleeping? Watching me? The police arrived within 20 minutes. They searched the property, but found no one. The backpack contained clothes, a knife, and an old phone with no SIM card. Whoever had been staying there had left in a hurry. The police suspected that someone had broken into the house, changed the locks, and rented it out multiple times to make money. A scam. But what disturbed me most was that the person who had been living there hadn't left, until now. Had they been watching me? Waiting for the real owner to come back? I didn't wait for more answers. I grabbed my bags and left that house for good. I reported the listing to Airbnb. They removed it immediately. but I couldn't shake the feeling that the scammer would just do it again with another house. A week later, the real owner emailed me. The police had found more sleeping bags in the woods behind his house. I never found out who had been staying there, but the thought that I had been sleeping in a house where a stranger had free access, where they might have been watching me, still keeps me awake at night. I had always loved renting Airbnbs in quiet, secluded locations. Something about being away from the city, in a house that wasn't mine, had a strange but pleasant appeal. It felt like stepping into another life for a short while. When my girlfriend Lisa and I found a charming, reasonably priced house for a weekend getaway, we booked it immediately. It was in a small town a few hours from where we lived, tucked away at the end of a winding gravel road, surrounded by thick trees. The listing showed a cozy two-bedroom house with a wraparound porch, a fully stocked kitchen, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Perfect for a quiet escape. We arrived late in the afternoon. The house was exactly as it had appeared in the photos, warm, welcoming, with rustic decor and a comfortable atmosphere. It smelled faintly of wood and old books, like a place that had been lived in but not abandoned. The host had left a small note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome. Make yourself at home. If you need anything, feel free to text. Enjoy your stay." There was nothing out of the ordinary. Lisa and I explored the house, placing our bags in the master bedroom and checking out the second bedroom, which was empty except for a neatly made bed and a nightstand. The living room had a large couch, a coffee table, and a few shelves lined with old paperbacks. Everything was as expected until we noticed the third door. At the end of the hallway, past the two bedrooms and the bathroom, there was a door that hadn't been mentioned in the listing. It was painted the same color as the walls, almost blending in. If we hadn't been walking down the hall, we might have missed it entirely. "Was this in the pictures?" Lisa asked, tilting her head. "I don't think so," I said. "Maybe it's a closet?" I reached for the doorknob and turned it, but it didn't budge. Locked. That wasn't too unusual. Some owners kept storage closets locked in their rentals. But something about this door unsettled me. It felt out of place, like it wasn't supposed to be there. Lisa shrugged. "Probably just supplies or cleaning stuff." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, after a simple dinner and a movie on the couch, we went to bed. The house was silent except for the occasional rustle of trees outside. Lisa fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about that door. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up abruptly to a sound. A soft, steady noise. Scratching. I held my breath and listened. It was coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate scratching sound, like fingernails dragging against wood. My heart started pounding as I turned my head toward the bedroom door. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. I nudged Lisa. "Lisa, wake up." She groaned and shifted. "What? Do you hear that?" She was silent for a moment, then sat up. "What is that?" I got out of bed as quietly as possible and crept toward the door. The scratching had stopped. I opened the bedroom door slowly and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. Just the dimly lit corridor and the closed, locked door at the end. Lisa followed behind me, rubbing her arms. That sounded like it was coming from inside. I nodded. It was. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I knocked lightly. Silence. Lisa grabbed my arm. "Let's just go back to bed. It's probably mice or something." I hesitated before stepping away. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew that hadn't been mice. That noise had been too deliberate, too slow. We went back to bed, but I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, my mind replayed the sound over and over again. By morning, I had convinced myself that it had been my imagination, amplified by the unfamiliar surroundings. We spent most of the next day in town, visiting small shops and trying local food. By the time we returned to the house in the evening, I had almost forgotten about the night before. Almost. But as we were getting ready for bed, something caught my attention. The door. It was slightly open, just an inch or two, but enough to see that it had definitely been unlocked. Lisa saw it too. Nope. We are not doing this," she said, grabbing her phone. "I'm calling the host." I stepped toward the door, heart hammering. "Wait, let me just..." "No," she said, voice sharp. "This isn't normal. It was locked yesterday. You checked it." Doors don't unlock themselves. I knew she was right. I also knew that I had to look. I reached forward and pushed the door open. Inside was darkness. A set of wooden stairs led down into a basement, something that hadn't been mentioned in the listing either. The air that drifted up was damp and stale, carrying a faint, rotten odor. Lisa was already dialing. The host picked up on the third ring. "Hello. Hi, this is Lisa. We're staying at your Airbnb and..." She hesitated, glancing at me. One of the doors opened on its own. We didn't even know there was a basement. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, the host said something that sent a chill through my body. "You opened it?" Lisa's face paled. "Yes." "Why?" Another pause. Then, the host exhaled sharply. "You need to leave. Now." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "Leave the house," the host said, voice urgent. "Get in your car and drive away. I'll refund everything. Just get out." Lisa grabbed my arm, already moving toward the door. "We're leaving." I hesitated for half a second before slamming the basement door shut. We grabbed our bags in record time and ran to the car. As we sped down the dark gravel road, my hands shook on the wheel. The host never explained what was down there. The listing disappeared from Airbnb the next day, and I still don't know what was behind that door. I had been traveling alone for a while, hopping between Airbnbs to get a break from city life. This particular listing caught my attention, a cozy, single-bedroom guest house in a quiet wooded area just outside a small town. The photos showed a clean, modern space with large windows, plenty of natural light, and a deck overlooking a thick patch of trees. It looked peaceful. The host had stellar reviews, and the price was surprisingly affordable. I booked it for 5 nights. The drive there was uneventful. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, and the roads leading to the guest house twisted through dense woods, making me feel more isolated with every mile. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house itself looked just as advertised. It was a single-story building, detached from the main house, with its own entrance and a small yard bordered by thick trees. The only odd thing was the bathroom window. It was small and high up, positioned just above the toilet, with a frosted glass panel. I met the host briefly. He was an older man named Greg, friendly but a little reserved. He handed me the keys and told me to call if I needed anything. "Cell reception is spotty here," he added, "but the Wi-Fi should work fine. Just don't be surprised if you lose service out in the woods." I nodded, not thinking much of it. I wasn't planning to go wandering in the trees anyway. I spent most of the first evening settling in, making myself dinner, and watching a movie. The guest house was comfortable, and I felt relaxed. I had a book with me, so I decided to wind down by taking a shower and then reading before bed. The bathroom was small but clean, with white tiles and modern fixtures. The window above the toilet let in a faint glow from the moon outside, its frosted glass diffusing the light. As I brushed my teeth, I felt an odd sensation, like I was being watched. It was subtle, just a nagging feeling at the back of my mind. I turned to look at the window. Nothing. Just the same frosted glass, the blurry outline of trees beyond it. I shook off the feeling, finished up, and went to bed. The second night was when things changed. I had spent the day exploring the nearby town, checking out local shops and a small cafe. By the time I got back to the guest house, it was already dark. I locked the doors, made dinner, and decided to shower before bed. As I stepped into the bathroom, that uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. The air felt heavier. I ignored it and turned on the shower, letting the hot water relax me. Then I saw it. Through the steam, through the frosted glass, a shape. A face. I froze. The features weren't clear, but I could see the general outline, a head, eyes, a mouth. It was pressed against the glass from the outside, staring in. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. My mind struggled to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the light? A reflection? No. Someone was standing outside my bathroom window, looking in. I stepped out of the shower, my heart pounding. I grabbed a towel and forced myself to move closer to the window. My hand shook as I reached out and flicked the bathroom light off, hoping to see more clearly. Nothing. The face was gone. I stood there, dripping wet, listening. The night outside was silent. No footsteps. No rustling in the trees. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they had vanished. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the frosted glass had distorted the trees outside in just the right way. Maybe I had been half asleep, but something about it lingered in my mind all day. I kept glancing at the bathroom window, even in broad daylight. I avoided using the bathroom unless absolutely necessary. That night, I decided I needed to know for sure. Before I showered, I turned off all the lights in the guest house. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera, and set it to video mode. Carefully, I propped it up on the bathroom sink, facing the window. I showered quickly, all the while feeling my skin crawl. The moment I was done, I grabbed my phone and reviewed the footage. At first, nothing. Just me moving around, steam clouding the view. Then, at the 4-minute mark, the screen flickered. A shadow appeared outside the window. A face, motionless, watching. And then, it smiled. I dropped my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up. The video ended a few seconds later, the figure still there, grinning at me through the glass. I grabbed my keys, threw on clothes, and bolted out of the guest house. I ran to the main house and pounded on Greg's door. He answered, looking groggy. "What's wrong?" "Someone was outside my window," I gasped, still clutching my phone. "I have it on video." His face changed. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired, like he had heard this before. "Come inside," he said. I sat in Greg's living room, still shaking as I showed him the footage. He watched in silence, then sighed and rubbed his temples. "You're not the first guest to see him." I stared. "Him?" Greg hesitated. "Years ago, a man used to live on this land. He wasn't well. People in town knew to stay away from him. He liked watching people. From windows. He was arrested a few times, but he always came back." "So he's still around?" I asked, my voice unsteady. Greg shook his head. "No, he died. A long time ago." A cold wave of dread washed over me. "Then who the hell was that?" I whispered. Greg didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. I left that night, abandoning my stay. I didn't care about the refund. I drove straight to the next town and booked a hotel. I barely slept, checking my windows every few minutes, waiting for a face to appear. Nothing ever did. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the history of the property. There had indeed been a man, Richard Calloway. He had been arrested multiple times for stalking, peering into windows, and even breaking into homes. In 1998, he had vanished into the woods behind the house. They never found his body. And to this day, guests at that Airbnb still report the same thing. A shadowy figure, standing outside the bathroom window, watching. I don't normally get paranoid about staying in Airbnbs. I've rented plenty over the years, some sketchier than others, but nothing ever made me feel genuinely unsafe. That changed with this trip. It was supposed to be a fun getaway with friends, nothing extravagant. Just a long weekend in a large house in the countryside, away from the noise of the city. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Kevin, his girlfriend Sarah, and our 2 other friends, Mark and Jess. We'd planned this trip for months, excited to disconnect, drink by the fire, and just enjoy a break from reality. The house we booked was about a 3-hour drive from where we lived, a sprawling 2-story cabin-like home with a huge backyard that stretched into dense woods. The listing showed a beautiful, rustic interior, large bedrooms, and an open living room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the forest. It seemed perfect. The host was a woman named Diane. She messaged me the morning of check-in to say everything was ready for us. She also mentioned that the previous guests had checked out earlier that morning, so the house was freshly cleaned and good to go. We arrived around 5 p.m. The place looked just like the pictures, if not better. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, giving everything a golden glow. The house was surrounded by nothing but wilderness. No neighbors, no visible roads, just trees in every direction. It was exactly what we wanted. The key was in a lockbox by the door. I punched in the code, grabbed it, and pushed the front door open. The house smelled faintly of pine and cleaning products. The furniture was stylish yet cozy, and the fireplace in the center of the living room made it feel inviting. Everything seemed perfect. At first, the first few hours were normal. We unpacked, picked our rooms, and started making dinner. I took the largest bedroom upstairs, which had a balcony overlooking the backyard. The others split the remaining rooms, with Mark and Jess taking the one next to mine and Kevin and Sarah grabbing the one downstairs. As I was putting my bag in the closet, I noticed something strange. There was a backpack shoved into the corner of the closet. It wasn't mine. I picked it up, unzipped it slightly, and saw clothes inside. "Hey," I called out, walking back to the hallway. "Did someone leave a bag in my room?" Kevin, who was carrying a case of beer into the kitchen, glanced up. "What?" I held up the backpack. "This was in my closet." Mark stepped out of his room. "Maybe the cleaning crew forgot it?" "Could be," I said, but something about it felt off. The house was spotless, so how could they have missed an entire backpack? I put it on the floor by the bedroom door and made a mental note to message the host about it later. Dinner went smoothly. We grilled outside, drank beers, and watched the sun dip below the tree line. By the time it got dark, we were already a little buzzed, laughing and reminiscing about old college stories. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that I noticed something strange again. I had gone inside to grab more drinks from the fridge when I heard a soft creaking noise coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, just subtle enough to make me freeze. I glanced toward the staircase. "Hey," I called out. "Anyone upstairs?" No answer. I walked up slowly, my ears straining for any sound. As I reached the top, I saw that the door to the storage closet at the end of the hall was slightly open. My stomach tightened. I knew for a fact that door had been closed when we arrived. I stepped toward it hesitantly. The house was old, and doors settling or shifting wasn't unusual, but something about the way it was cracked open made me uneasy. I reached forward and nudged it open. The closet was mostly empty, except for a few cleaning supplies on the top shelf. I exhaled, shaking my head. Probably just a draft. Still, I shut it firmly before heading back downstairs. By midnight, we were all exhausted. One by one, we drifted off to our rooms. I fell asleep quickly, but at some point during the night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch dark. The only sound was the faint rustling of trees outside. I had no idea what had woken me up, but my heart was pounding. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. Not outside. Inside. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my room. For a second, I thought it was Mark or Jess going to the bathroom. But then I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. The sound of a door creaking open. I felt my chest tighten. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The footsteps stopped for a long moment, and then they started again, this time moving away. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I asked if anyone had gotten up during the night. Mark shook his head. "Nah, I slept straight through." Sarah frowned. "I thought I heard something too, actually. Like footsteps." I nodded slowly. That's when Jess spoke up. "Hey, did any of you go into our room last night?" We all turned to her. "What?" Kevin asked. "Our door was unlocked this morning," she said. "I know for a fact we locked it before going to bed." A heavy silence settled over us. I suddenly remembered the storage closet door being open the night before. The backpack in my room. The footsteps. A bad feeling crawled over my skin. "I think we need to check the house," I said quietly. We searched the entire house. The closets, the bathrooms, even under the beds. Then we found it. A small attic hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. None of us had noticed it before. The ceiling was high, and there was no ladder. But there was a small rope hanging from it. My stomach dropped. "There's no way the host cleans this house regularly and never mentioned an attic," Sarah whispered. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and pulled the rope. The hatch creaked open. A rush of cold, stale air came down. Mark lifted his phone flashlight and shined it inside. And that's when we saw it. A mattress, a pile of blankets, empty food wrappers, and worst of all, a pair of dirty boots. Someone had been living there. I felt a wave of nausea. Had they been there the whole time? Watching us? Coming down at night while we slept? We didn't stay to find out. We packed our bags in 5 minutes flat and drove away, not looking back. I messaged the host and told her everything. She never responded. A week later, the listing was removed from Airbnb. To this day, I have no idea who was living in that attic or how long they had been there. I always preferred hiking alone. It wasn't that I disliked company, but there was something about being out there by myself that made the experience feel more personal, more real. I could move at my own pace, take in the surroundings without distraction, and just exist in the wilderness without feeling the need to entertain conversation. That's why, on a cool October morning, I decided to tackle a new trail I had read about, a remote ridge line deep in the mountains, barely maintained, only spoken of in online hiking forums. It wasn't an official trail, but people had mapped out a route over time, and that was good enough for me. I printed out a topographic map, downloaded GPS waypoints, and packed enough supplies for a full day. I parked my car at the trailhead, a forgotten pull-off on a narrow gravel road, and started up the faint path. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my lungs as I ascended. The first few miles were uneventful, just the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt, the occasional chirp of birds, and the distant rustling of unseen animals in the underbrush. After about an hour, the trail became steeper, winding up the side of the ridge. I moved carefully, watching for loose rocks and unstable ground. The trees started to thin out, revealing glimpses of the valley far below. The higher I climbed, the more isolated I felt. There was no cell service here, no sign of other hikers. Just me and the mountains. Reaching the top of the ridge was rewarding. The view stretched for miles in every direction. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, a river snaking through the valley, the sky a bright, endless blue. I took a few minutes to rest, sipping from my water bottle and adjusting my pack. This was the part one had been looking forward to, following the ridge line for a few miles before descending back down to the road where I had parked. The trail was faint, barely more than a game path in some spots, but I had my GPS and map to keep me on track. It was slow going. The terrain was uneven, the wind stronger up here, and the occasional drop-offs on either side made me hyper-aware of my footing. An hour passed. Then another. The ridge stretched on longer than I expected. I checked my GPS. It showed I was still on the right path, but something felt off. I had studied this route beforehand, traced it on my map multiple times, and it didn't seem like it should be taking this long. The sun was lower than I liked. I picked up my pace. Then I saw it. A boot print in the dirt. It wasn't mine. It was slightly larger, fresher. I hadn't seen another person all day, and there were no other cars at the trailhead when I arrived. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to pass through at different times, but something about it gave me a bad feeling. I kept moving. Minutes later, I noticed something even more disturbing. Another boot print, then another, and another. But they weren't moving in a straight line, like someone following the trail. They crisscrossed, doubled back, veered off, returned. Someone had been wandering, not hiking. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing unease in my gut. Maybe someone had gotten turned around. Maybe a hunter had been scouting the area. I told myself anything to keep my mind from going to darker places. Then, up ahead, something caught my eye. A small bundle of sticks, arranged in a pattern, right in the middle of the trail. It looked deliberate, like a marker. I hesitated, glancing around. The trees were taller here, casting long shadows. The wind had died down, making everything unnervingly quiet. I stepped around the sticks and kept going, my pace quicker now. 15 minutes later, I saw another bundle. Same pattern, same placement. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't just on a trail anymore. Someone had been here before me, leaving these. Why? I checked my GPS again. The route was taking longer than expected, but I was still on course. I convinced myself that if I just kept moving, I'd make it back before dark. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tree, stripped of its bark, with deep gouges in the wood. The marks weren't from an animal. They were deliberate, dragged through the wood in uneven strokes, some overlapping, as if done carelessly or in frustration. The more I looked, the more I saw, other trees with similar markings, spaced along the trail at irregular intervals. Something was very wrong. I forced myself forward. I wasn't stopping now. The last thing I wanted was to be caught out here in the dark. Then I heard it. A rustling sound. Not the wind. Not a bird. Something moving in the underbrush, behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I kept walking, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A person? My gut told me I didn't want to find out. The rustling came again. Closer this time. More distinct. My body screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running could make it worse. Running meant panic. Running meant noise. I adjusted my pack, gripping the straps tight, and walked faster. Every nerve in my body was on edge. My breath felt too loud. The sun was sinking, the light fading. Then I saw something that nearly made me break into a sprint. Up ahead, at the base of a tree, was a pile of bones. Small animal bones, arranged in the same pattern as the sticks. I moved past them without stopping, my body buzzing with adrenaline. And then finally, I saw the descent trail. the path leading down off the ridge, toward my car. Relief flooded me. I practically jogged down, ignoring the burning in my legs, not daring to look back. The sound behind me faded. The woods grew denser again, swallowing the ridge above. By the time I reached my car, the sky was deep blue, the first stars beginning to show. I threw my pack in the back seat, jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there, catching my breath. Only then did I dare to look back up at the ridge. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I don't know who or what was out there that day. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. But I've hiked alone for years, and I've never felt anything like that before. I haven't gone back to that ridge since. And I don't plan to, because whatever was out there, watching me, marking the trees, leaving those bones, it wanted me to know. I wasn't supposed to be there.